Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my November wrap-up. Things have been really busy lately. November was a time, for sure. I think we can all agree on that much. But in November, my wonderful friend Kim from Native Lady Book Warrior created and hosted the Skoden Readathon, and I read so many amazing books because of that, so let's just get into it. The first book I listened to in November was A Snake Falls to Earth by Darcy Littlebadger, read by Kinsale Houston and Sean Taylor Corbett. Darcy is, of course, the author of Alatsoe, one of my favorite books that I highly, highly recommend, and this is her second book. It follows a Lipan Apache character, Nina, a storyteller who very much believes in the old ways, and her great-grandmother told her this traditional story that she's still attempting to translate. Ollie is a cottonmouth shapeshifter who lives in a world of monsters and spirits that's parallel to ours, and after being cast from home, he's finally found a new home on the banks of a bottomless lake. Neither one of them knows that the other one exists, but when a catastrophic event on Earth causes one of Ollie's friends to come down with a very strange sickness, their two worlds are driven together in a way that they haven't been in many, many centuries. In terms of representation, as I said, the characters are Lipan Apache, and Nina, I believe, is also Ace. Content warnings for some instances of death, some descriptions of injured animals, in-depth explorations of natural disasters, as well as some instances of injury and violence. Darcy Littlebadger was already an auto-read author for me after Alatsoe, and I think this second book only further solidifies that choice. In this book, she's writing about the collision of worlds in multiple ways, and in a way that's incredibly rich and complex. Above all, I think the story is really tackling the question of how to navigate indigeneity in the 21st century. What does it look like to embrace and honor traditional culture, language, and values in a rapidly changing world that's quickly creating new problems on top of the problems that already exist? So I think that's one way that worlds are colliding in this story. Tradition is coming into contact with modern ideologies and technology and climate change and all these different things. You have Ollie, who kind of represents the traditional beliefs and values, who's born from the traditional world of creation and abundance, and is realizing that the fate of his world is tied with Nina's world, which exists in a completely different social, moral, and technological context. And it's definitely a two-way street, because all of the modern and even colonial ideologies, mindsets, and traditions that Nina considers to be second nature are not always holding up against the reality and perspective of Ollie and his friends. Another ideological collision that's happening is the meeting of actions and consequences. Obviously, Nina and Ollie are realizing not only that the other person's world exists, but that their respective worlds have an effect on each other, and in some ways share a single fate. So with increased technology, industrialism, and colonial constructs of capitalism and expansion, that has affected the climate, which creates even more severe natural disasters and in turn impacts the overall environment. The echoes of that impact resonate beyond our world, and I think that's definitely something the characters are having to contend with as well. I also keep mentioning a reckoning of technology, especially because that is a major thread that continuously comes up in the story. I think that's one of the more direct ways that Nina is having to navigate what it means to live in a modern world but still maintain traditional values. For example, with the story her great-grandmother told her, she figures she can just put it into a translation app and it'll pop out all the answers. But what she finds is that the app actually lacks the very quote-unquote dictionary and cultural syntax needed to even be able to detect the language itself. Another way that comes up is in how Nina is very interested in this app called Storyteller, I think, which is basically like a fictional version of TikTok, and she has this policy of using the app to tell traditional stories, but then always deleting those drafts. In both of those instances, with the story that's been passed down to her and how she has a firm boundary in what she will and will not share online, brings up the question of whether Indigenous stories, languages, and beliefs should even be widely disseminated in the first place. Some things don't belong to everyone. Some things deserve to be protected and held as sacred, and Nina is trying to figure out what that looks like, especially in a modern world where visibility and giving every part of yourself is almost demanded or expected as a form of social currency. So there's a lot of really interesting ideas at work here, and even beyond the thematic work, I thought the characters were incredibly endearing as well. There's so many layers of storytelling at play in this book, and I think it does such a great job of conveying traditional values about protecting and caring for the earth in a completely original way that's also incredibly mindful and thoughtful. And it beautifully illustrates why we should care for the world we live in, not only for ourselves and for future generations, but for worlds and realities and possibilities that we can't even begin to imagine. Another incredible piece of work from Darcy Littlebadger. I loved it so much and I gave it 4.5 stars. And for the bingo board, this book covered the queer/two-spirit space and the 7-day challenge space where you read nothing but Indigenous lit for 7 consecutive days. The next 2 books I picked up were actually picture books, and at first I wasn't sure if I should review them in this space, but then I was like, why not? They're books. The first one I picked up was We Are Water Protectors by Carol Lindstrom and Michaela Goad. This is inspired by the many Indigenous-led movements to protect our water sources, especially against pipeline mines and pollution, and it tells the story of an evil black snake that's threatening one of the world's most sacred and life-giving resources. This is so beautifully illustrated. I think it's a wonderful primer for young readers especially, or readers of any age, to begin engaging with why it's so important to protect our water sources. What stood out to me about it is that the story is almost told from this collective voice. There's not really a main character to the story, which I don't think is common in most picture books. Take that with a grain of salt. I definitely don't read enough of them to make any kind of definitive assessment, but I think typically these stories tend to rally around one central character that helps the young reader engage, empathize, and focus. There's definitely the image of a young person reoccurring throughout the book, don't get me wrong, but it's not really told from their perspective, and I think that makes it more powerful because it puts an emphasis on community and collective action. I'm not going to rate these picture books because I feel like they're a distinct and unique medium as compared to novels, and I don't read nearly enough of them to convey how that would break down on a 5-star scale, but I'm glad I picked this one up and I really enjoyed it. And for the bingo board, I counted this one towards the middle grade / children's space. The second picture book I picked up was Kapai Mahu by Hinale Moana Wangkalu, Joe Wilson, Dean Hamer, and Daniel Souza. You may recognize this story because it was actually first created as a short animated film, which I will link down below. It's available to watch for free through the PBS YouTube channel, and I believe that short film may have also been nominated for an Oscar as well. This tells the ancient story of these incredibly powerful magical individuals who brought their extraordinary healing arts from Tahiti to Hawaii, and they were known as Kapai Mahu, meaning to be of dual male and female spirits. These individuals were favored by the gods. They were revered and respected to the point where the indigenous peoples of Waikiki wanted to honor them with these sacred stones. The Kapai Mahu imbued these stones with their healing powers, and they were left as a monument to that history. But with the influx of American colonialism and capitalism and tourism, the meaning of those stones has been lost over time, and this story is trying to restore that knowledge. I really love the illustrations in this. I feel like stylistically and in terms of color palette, all the details come together to make this incredibly cohesive story that really honors its traditional and sacred roots. There's dignity and weight to the way this story has been created. I love how the story is first told in the original Kanaka Maoli language and then translated into English. I think it reflects the story's purpose of restoring the importance of indigenous power over colonial modes of thinking and existing. It's also about showing reverence for these deified Mahu figures who occupy a space beyond the binary, beyond the colonial constructs of gender, and actively challenges the historical erasure of those peoples. And I feel like the story itself is an incredibly compelling take on reclaiming indigenous values and beliefs, and showing how understanding the world our modern land was built over both structurally and culturally begins with a knowledge and respect for those roots. I definitely recommend this book, and the short film is stunningly animated and produced as well. You can definitely tell that the creation of the story in both mediums was an act of love, and it is definitely worth watching, reading, or both. For the bingo board, this one counted for the Beyond the Lower 48 prompt, which is basically a challenge to read about indigenous nations that exist beyond the 48 states geographically contained between Canada and Mexico. After that, I read a short story collection called Night of the Living Rez by Morgan Talty. Morgan Talty is a citizen of the Penobscot Indian Nation in what is now known as Maine, which also happens to be where these stories take place. They're actually a series of interconnected short stories that pretty much follow one character over the course of his lifetime, and it's like a slow unraveling of his family and his community that seems to be set in motion from his childhood when he digs up this jar that's said to contain an old curse. Content warnings for references to depression, dementia, and seizures, allusions to miscarriages, some graphic violence, injury, and details of a car accident, mentions of alcoholism, drug use, and drug addiction, instances of domestic abuse and rape, and references to child death. Now, I don't read too many short story collections, and it's not for lack of interest. I just think as a student of writing, I may be burned out on the form, and it's hard for me to engage without re-traumatizing myself, to be quite frank, but this collection is fantastic. This collection had me hooked from the very start. Even the way Morgan Talty is challenging the reader to rethink how we define a short story and what the form can look like beyond the hard limits of imagination that Western writing and literature has placed upon it and imposed upon it is truly such a gift. I love that this collection is a non-linear examination of one character's life on this reservation and the different things he's experiencing, the shocking and unsettling problems he's confronted with throughout his life, both things that have clear real-world explanations and things that don't. Especially with interconnected short stories, I think you always run the risk of people criticizing that there's no reason this collection shouldn't be one cohesive long-form novel, but through these disparate glimpses of the main character's life, Talty makes a really compelling case for why these stories have to be separate. There's really no connective tissue, at least in terms of a distinguishing timeline, that are connecting these stories. The relationship between these experiences are not dependent on causal factors. What happens in one story doesn't lead to the next one, and in that way couldn't possibly translate into a novel and still be as incredibly effective as it is. I think it all goes back to what I first said, how this collection explores both trauma that has traceable roots and trauma that is happening anew in the present moment that doesn't really have any clear ties to any diagnosable cause. And I think in some ways that's the author speaking to the reality of what it is to be an Indigenous person in the modern world, how you're expected to reckon with years of colonial trauma that are still rippling outwards, but also dealing with new forms of colonial trauma that are unfolding in new and horrifically unpredictable ways. I know it might be a cliche descriptor, but these stories are so incredibly captivating. The characters feel real, the relationships feel real, the community feels real, and every detail is not only striking, but it serves a distinct narrative purpose. And I think thematically it's a really powerful collection. The title is obviously a playoff of Night of the Living Dead, which is about mindless, flesh-eating monsters. And in many ways I think this collection is interrogating how cycles of trauma disintegrate our humanity and what it means to be trapped and walled in by that sort of mindless, senseless violence. As it comes up in the collection, the real question is not how did we get here, but rather how can we get out of this place of trauma or pain or confusion or perhaps most hauntingly, sameness. I cannot overstate how incredible this collection is. I will absolutely be keeping an eye on whatever Morgan Talty does next because I want to read it. I gave this 5 stars. As for the bingo board, this book counted towards short story versus poetry and also the Amau book cover space because it has all the colors on it, red, yellow, blue, and black. After that, I did have to temporarily detour my TBR to read my arc of Three Kings by Freydis Moon. This is now available. It was self-published by the author on November 22nd. It's a queer polyamorous romance that's equal parts cozy and erotic. And of course, with Freydis, why would you expect anything less? The story is set in a cold seaside town where this trans witch named Ethan lives with his fisherman husband in a tiny lighthouse. One day, his husband Peter brings home what he believes to be an injured animal that was caught in their fishing net, but Ethan is convinced it's actually a Selkie who can't transform back into their human form with their current injuries. So he sets about healing the Selkie, who turns out to be named Nico, and then Nico is recovering in their home where all 3 of them being together seems to be awakening a lot of new feelings and possibilities. Content warnings for some descriptions of blood used for magical purposes, very strong focus on issues of infertility and child conception, some references to graphic injury, and explicit sexual content. Listen, 2022 has been nothing if not my year of Freydis Moon. I have read and loved everything they've written so far, and Three Kings was never going to be any kind of exception. I am truly amazed at how they're able to walk this tightrope between cozy sweetness and downright gloriously erotic filth in this particular story, and neither of those things is able to cancel out the other, nor should it, which is a really impressive feat. On the one hand, this is such a charming and inviting story. It's very much low plot, high aesthetic. It truly does transport you to this cloudy little seaside town where this trans witch is tending his garden and mixing up spells and just trying to make a good life with his husband in their lighthouse. I also just want to say that this is very much the kind of story that can change lives. It provides some very necessary representation not only for trans mass folks or trans men who desire to carry a pregnancy in their own bodies, but also people embracing polyamory at a later stage in life. Both of those experiences are often demonized or stigmatized in their own ways. There's also no predetermined path that allows trans people especially to safely and readily access those things. So to see them not only paralleled against each other, but also framed in such a way that's so incredibly open and gentle is valuable in a way that I cannot fully express. Three Kings really welcomes in the complexity of those experiences, not only in the doubt, the confusion, or the pain they can bring, but also the joy and the freedom that can be found when things do finally align in the right circumstances. But also I feel like this story is really about contending with the true cost of hope. It's about hope as a double-edged sword. Obviously, hope can be really beautiful and very necessary. It can give us purpose when things are really, really difficult, but it can also so easily slip through our fingers. Hope can be a torch to light our way in the darkness, but it can also be exhausting to keep that light from being extinguished, even more so when the world constantly demands us to prove that we are worthy of being touched by that light in the first place. And I also think there's this deeper theme of forcibly wresting control from the uncontrollable, especially with Ethan not only having brought this Selkie back from the brink of death, but also essentially bringing his husband back to life after this horrific storm that happens before the story begins. To me, that really ties in with those themes about hope, especially its necessity and lasting power, and how it seems to be this force that somehow resurrects itself even in the worst of circumstances. Along with that, there's a great exploration of how both joy and tension can coexist within the experience experience of discovery, especially self-discovery, as is the case with Ethan, Peter, and Nika realizing that they all want to be together. That new experience of desire represents a disruption to their previously monogamous marriage, and change can be scary. Ultimately, I feel like this is such a tender story about the alchemical force that is change, the things that won't survive without changing, the things that are always in a constant state of change, the fundamental things about ourselves and those we love that will never change, and the truly unique magic of accepting that all of them can be happening to us at once. To be very clear, I cannot speak to the experiences of infertility, pregnancy, or polyamory. I cannot make any sort of assessment on how they're presented. I feel as though they're all fairly thoughtfully explored, but again, that is not my place. Even with that aside, I still gave this 5 stars. Then I got to a top priority for the month, which was A Minor Chorus by Billy Ray Belcourt. Billy Ray Belcourt is a queer two-spirit indigenous scholar, poet, and writer of the Driftpile Cree Nation, and this is his debut fiction novel, and oh boy, it did not disappoint. Similar to Making Love with the Land by Joshua Whitehead, the story seems to be playing in the spaces between fiction, metafiction, poetry, autofiction. It's about a queer indigenous doctoral student who's actually decided to step away from writing his dissertation because he no longer feels connected to that work, and he starts wanting to go back to his community so he can conduct interviews that might help him channel that same work into fiction instead. Amid all these conversations, he's haunted by the memory of his cousin Jack, who was caught up in drugs and eventually arrested, and he starts wondering about the ways that the world might inevitably force his own path to parallel Jack's. Content warnings for some experiences of violence, police brutality, and anti-indigenous violence, drug use, mentions of suicide, homophobia, and mentions of conversion therapy, some references to miscarriage, explorations of residential school trauma, some depictions of abuse, and some sexual content. I said this when I talked about A History of My Brief Body, which is Billy Ray Belcourt's memoir, but Billy Ray is first and foremost a poet. The way he accesses emotion, character, timeline, and plot comes through as poetry. You as the reader are just communing with the poetry in his soul that you can feel in the way he writes. So whether he's writing fiction or nonfiction, and again this story is sort of blending both of those things, it's all poetry. So you have to give yourself over to it, which is not hard to do at all, and also understand that it's not going to be told in a way that can be parsed by Western colonial criteria of story and structure. If you can't do that, then there's so much about this story that you're gonna miss. First of all, I appreciate how the story is a critique of academia, especially in its structures of gatekeeping, cultural genocide, and erasure that are built into the very foundation of the entire system itself. The story starts with the narrator reaching his breaking point where he's realizing that he doesn't want to theorize or intellectualize his own experience through Western linguistics and perspectives, especially for a primarily colonial audience. Doing so is not going to grant him the freedom he so desperately seeks, but at the same time, it's also not an over-romanticization of community, which I think would be very easy to do as this narrator is returning to his reservation and using these interviews as an inspiration for what he wants to write. His community, while very integral to his experience of culture and understanding of himself, is not the answer to all his problems. And what's more, I think the story beautifully articulates how our community and experience of culture is essential for informing who we are and how we parse the world, but also how that same community can be limiting and deprive us of the language and concepts we need to truly understand ourselves. The story understands why so many marginalized people almost depend on academia to provide the language and social legibility that we're often deprived of in our upbringing, but then also interrogates why we should even have to depend on such elitist colonial standards of education to fill in those gaps in the first place. There's also this other layer of the communal voice that this story and this narrator are trying to honor in so many ways. That's where the title comes from, how this story is just a minor chorus that's part of a much larger culture and picture, and how marginalized people are violently expected to represent the voice of our communities when we try to tell our own stories. So in many ways, this process of interviewing different friends and family members is an acknowledgement on the narrator's part of how he can't possibly be the only one to tell the story of this community, and if he tried, it would be a story that's inherently false in its premise. There's just so much complexity happening in such a short space. The writing is incredible. It disarms you almost in its clarity and its beauty. I am once again in awe of Billy Ray Belcourt's talent. Whatever he does next, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, all of the above, I am going to read it. For me, this was 5 stars. Going back to the Skoden Readathon bingo board, I don't think this checked off any new challenges, but it could once again be counted towards the Beyond the Lower 48 space and the queer/two-spirit space. And last but certainly not least, I listened to my Patreon pick for the month, and my patrons voted for me to read Healer of the Water Monster by Brian Young, which was read by Sean Taylor Corbett. This is an extraordinary middle grade fantasy adventure about a young Navajo boy named Nathan who's given the option to spend his summer in Vegas with his dad and his dad's girlfriend, but he claims he should stay with his Nali in her mobile home on the Navajo reservation instead to get a head start on a school science project. So he's kind of resigned himself to a boring, uneventful summer hanging out with his Nali, but when his Uncle Jet shows up, having just lost another job, he brings a lot of problems with him. One night, Nathan gets lost in the desert and comes across a divine being from the Navajo creation story known as the Water Monster, who saves Nathan's life by getting him back home safely, and in exchange, he makes Nathan promise to help him heal from this mysterious sickness. So now Nathan finds himself caught between two worlds. He wants to be there for his uncle and his Nali, especially as his Uncle Jet is facing his own battles, but he also has this epic journey to undertake in the third world, and slowly he realizes that these two problems might actually be connected. Content warnings for some experienced fat phobia, depictions of alcoholism, depression, anxiety, allusions to suicide ideation, and some references to wartime PTSD, some instances of death and grief, as well as some instances of violence. I love this book so much. It is phenomenal. I gave it 4.5 stars, but unfortunately, I can't review it in depth because this imprint exists in partnership with HarperCollins, and the HarperCollins union is currently on strike to fight for better, more livable wages. Obviously, I support that fight. They have a great Instagram page, which I will include down below. It has a ton of information about why they're doing this, how you can support them, things they're asking people to do and not do, and one of the things they've asked reviewers not to do is review HarperCollins books. To be clear, they are not calling for a boycott of HarperCollins titles at this time, which would first and foremost hurt authors who are not involved with how much industry professionals are paid. So you can still read this book, buy it, borrow it, add it to your wish list, add it online, all of which are things I encourage you to do and why I still shared what it's about because it is fantastic. To be completely honest, I struggled with whether I should just review this one anyways, obviously with a disclaimer beforehand, simply because Indigenous authors and titles are at a significant disadvantage in this industry, even when compared to other BIPOC and marginalized authors. Lee & Low has a great diversity survey, and when looking at the entire industry, Indigenous professionals of any kind make up less than 1%. The CCBC also tracks diversity in publishing every year, and most notably in 2018, they made this graphic showing that children's books represented animals 27% times more than Indigenous characters. And you might be thinking, that was 2018, that was quite a while ago, does that still count? Yes, it does, because this industry works incredibly slow, and I promise you the changes in representation across the board are not going as quickly as you think. But also this more recent study from 2021 shows that only 47 of roughly 3,200 newly published books submitted to the CCBC had Indigenous characters, which is not even 0.02%. I wanted to share all that information with you because obviously I'm not going to cross the picket line, even though marketers and publicity folks are not scouring YouTube for reviews or copy that they can repurpose because that is simply too much work, but also to help you think about what a difference it makes to read, talk about, share, and support these stories and authors in a larger context. And also to show that even though we should absolutely be honoring whatever it is the union workers are asking us to do, this ban on reviews is not black and white, and it does not impact all authors and titles equally across the board. It genuinely hurts me to not be able to review this book because it deserves so much love and so much support, and I hate that not reviewing it puts an already disadvantaged author at even more of a disadvantage. I say all this in complete transparency to say that as a reviewer in this particular instance, it has been really difficult to navigate this. So I will include a link down below to my Storygraph and Goodreads reviews for this book, which are currently blank and will stay blank until the strike ends, and as soon as it does end, I will add a written review for this book. That is the best compromise I can think of right now, and again, all I can say is that if you're able to, I encourage you to pick up this book. For the bingo board, I use this one to count towards unread Indigenous author and once again the middle grade / children's space, and at the end of the month, this is what my bingo board looked like. Anyways, kind of a weird note to end on, but also a very necessary one. I will include links to all of those sources and studies down below if you want to read even more about them as well. But anyways, those are all the books I read in November. Thanks to Kim, it was one of the best reading months I've had in a while, and I enjoyed all of these books. In the comments down below, let me know if you've read any of these books yourself, what you thought about them, or even what you plan to read next. But that's everything I had to share for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.